That's Officer and Gentleman. Wow. And I did watch the whole movie.
It's the movie that made an entire generation believe a man in dress whites could walk into a paper mill, scoop a woman up in his arms, and somehow make it feel earned instead of ridiculous. Released by Paramount in the summer of 1982, An Officer and a Gentleman follows Zach Mayo, a cynical drifter with a chip on his shoulder, as he claws his way through the U.S. Navy's Aviation Officer Candidate School. Richard Gere plays Mayo, the recruit who has to be broken down before he can be built back up. Debra Winger plays Paula, the local factory worker who falls for him against her better judgment. And Louis Gossett Jr. plays Gunnery Sergeant Emil Foley, the drill instructor standing between Mayo and a set of officers' wings. Audiences went in for the romance and stayed for the boot camp grit, the heartbreak, and that unforgettable factory floor ending. It became one of the biggest sleeper hits of the entire decade and one of the most imitated love stories in movie history. But almost none of that was supposed to happen. The script sat rejected for years. The Navy refused to help. The leading man almost wasn't Richard Gere at all. And the ending everyone remembers nearly got thrown out entirely. Here are 15 facts about how this unlikely movie actually came together. Stick around, because the very last one involves a quiet, almost sad footnote about the two stars who made us believe in that romance in the first place. It's a movie that, by nearly every account of how the studio system usually works, should never have existed in the form we know it. And yet here it is, still turning up on best romance lists more than 40 years later. Before we get into it, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Long before it was an Oscar winner, this script was just a stack of paper nobody in Hollywood wanted to touch. Writer Douglas Day Stewart drafted it based on his own life. In the early 1960s, he'd gone through the Navy's grueling officer candidate training himself, hoping to become a pilot, only to be medically disqualified before he ever got the chance to fly. During that same stretch of training, he dated a local factory worker, the exact relationship that would eventually become Paula's story on screen, right down to the setting. Stewart has said plainly, in interviews decades later, that studios in the 1970s simply weren't interested in a story sympathetic to the military. The wounds of Vietnam were still raw, and a script that treated Navy life and a Navy man's redemption as something worth rooting for wasn't an easy sell in that cultural climate. So the screenplay made the rounds for years, collecting polite rejections from nearly every studio in town. It wasn't until the political mood in America shifted slightly in the early Reagan years, combined with a looming Writers Guild strike, that suddenly made finished, ready-to-shoot screenplays extremely valuable to nervous studios scrambling to stockpile material, that Paramount finally pulled Stewart's script off the shelf. A screenplay that had been quietly passed on for the better part of a decade suddenly became a rush production almost overnight, and within months, cameras were rolling on the Olympic Peninsula. Most military-themed movies get the red carpet treatment from the Pentagon. Real aircraft, real bases, technical advisors on every scene, sometimes even active-duty extras. This film got none of that. When the Navy reviewed an early draft of the script, they didn't like what they saw. Zach's father is portrayed as a boozing, skirt-chasing enlisted sailor, and Zach himself spends much of the film as a manipulative loner, scheming his way through training rather than embodying model recruit behavior. That's not exactly the kind of portrait a branch of the armed forces wants hanging in its recruiting offices, and the Navy declined to cooperate with the production in any official capacity. Without access to the real aviation officer candidate school at Naval Air Station Pensacola, in Florida, the filmmakers had to improvise an entire fictional base from scratch. They found a decommissioned U.S. Army post on Washington State's Olympic Peninsula, Fort Wardens, just outside the small town of Port Townsend, and spent weeks transforming its parade grounds and old coastal artillery batteries into a passable stand-in for a naval air station. Off-duty sailors and Marines stationed nearby on Whidbey Island crossed the water by ferry to work as paid extras, which gave the production a strange kind of backdoor authenticity. The Navy as an institution wanted nothing to do with the film, while plenty of its actual servicemen showed up anyway, in uniform, to help make it look real. It's almost impossible now to picture anyone else playing Zach Mayo, but Gere was actually a fairly late arrival to the role. The part was first signed, believe it or not, to folk singer John Denver. Yes, the Take Me Home, Country Roads guy. at one point genuinely attached to spend an entire film getting screamed at face down in the mud by a drill sergeant. When that arrangement fell apart, the role bounced around a genuine murderer's row of leading men of the era. Jeff Bridges, Christopher Reeve, and Harry Hamlin were all considered or approached at various points in development. John Travolta was also offered the part and turned it down, which carried a strange symmetry, since Travolta had already passed on the lead role in American Gigolo 2 years earlier, the very film that first turned Richard Gere into a star. Gere himself wasn't exactly desperate to sign on either. He since admitted, in a candid interview with Barbara Walters, that he mainly took the job for the money rather than any burning creative ambition. It turned out to be the best-paying decision of his career up to that point. The film became his biggest box office hit at the time, a distinction it held until Pretty Woman eventually surpassed it nearly a decade later. Most actors arrive at a production with an agent, a lawyer, and a stack of protective contract clauses already in place. Debra Winger negotiated her deal for this film almost entirely on her own, without an agent representing her interests, and by multiple accounts, she signed on before she had even read the fully revised shooting script. That independence came at a real cost, because her contract didn't include the standard, no nudity, clause most working actors insist on. When a pivotal love scene was ultimately written to require nudity she hadn't agreed to in advance, she had essentially no legal ground to refuse or request alterations. She reportedly asked the production to cover her up for the scene, and was told, in effect, that because she hadn't secured that protection in writing, she was contractually obligated to shoot it as written. According to several accounts from the production, Winger found the experience of filming those intimate scenes deeply uncomfortable, describing the atmosphere as one that made her withdraw emotionally rather than perform naturally in front of the camera. It's a strange and somewhat sobering footnote to a film now remembered almost entirely for its wholesome, tear-jerking final embrace. Speaking of that love scene, it very nearly kept the entire movie out of most American theaters. When Paramount submitted the finished film to the Motion Picture Association of America for a rating, the board came back with an X, largely because of the intensity of the intimacy between Gere and Winger's characters. In the early 1980s, an X rating was close to a commercial death sentence for a mainstream studio release. Many newspapers refused to run advertisements for X-rated films, television networks wouldn't air trailers for them, and a large share of American theater chains had blanket policies against booking them at all. Facing the very real possibility that their romantic drama would never reach a wide audience, Paramount appealed the rating, trimmed and reframed the sequence, just enough to satisfy the censors, and successfully got it knocked down to an R. It's worth sitting with that for a second. One of the defining date-night movies of the entire decade came within a single failed appeal of never reaching the mainstream audience that eventually made it a phenomenon. On the page, Douglas Day Stewart's Gunnery Sergeant Emile Foley wasn't written as a black character, and the studio initially chased big, established leading man names to fill the role. Jack Nicholson was approached early on and passed. Mandy Patinkin gave an audition that reportedly impressed the producers a great deal, but director Taylor Hackford ultimately felt he wasn't the right fit for the part, describing a mismatch that he couldn't quite put his finger on. Rather than keep auditioning famous names, Hackford took a research trip down to the Real Aviation Officer Candidate School in Pensacola, Florida, to study the actual men who put college kids through their paces every training cycle. What he found there reshaped the entire role. Many of the most feared, most respected drill instructors on that base were black men, a detail nothing in the original script had anticipated. That discovery is what sent the casting search in an entirely different direction, and it's how Louis Gossett Jr. eventually walked into the audition room, mentioned his own background serving as an Army Ranger, and secured the role almost immediately. Richard Gere got the poster and the marquee billing, but ask most people what they actually remember from this film, and Sergeant Foley usually comes up first. At the 1983 Academy Awards, that performance earned Louis Gossett Jr. the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, making him the first black man ever to win in that category in the Academy's history. It was only the second time a black man had won any acting Oscar at all, 19 years after Sidney Poitier's groundbreaking Best Actor win for Lilies of the Field in 1964. Gossett also took home a Golden Globe for the same role that same year. In his memoir, Gossett described the Oscar win as an enormous personal affirmation of his standing as a black actor working in an industry that had rarely made room for performers who looked like him. And yet, by his own account, that historic win didn't immediately open the doors he might have hoped for. He said that he didn't land another film role for roughly a year afterward, joking ruefully that Hollywood simply wasn't ready for him to have won. Decades later, tributes following his passing in 2024 consistently pointed back to this exact performance as the one that changed what was possible for black actors at the Academy Awards, and film historians still cite it as one of the handful of Oscar wins from the era that carried weight far beyond the ceremony itself. On screen, Zach and Paula feel completely believable. The longing looks, the arguments, the eventual surrender to each other. Off-screen, by numerous accounts from cast members, crew, and the two leads themselves over the years, Gere and Winger simply did not get along. Winger has been fairly candid in interviews about how difficult she found working alongside Gere during the shoot, while Gere has generally taken a more measured public tone, mostly acknowledging that there was tension between them without going into extensive detail. Whatever friction existed between takes clearly never made it onto film, which is arguably a credit to both performers. Audiences who watched the movie in theaters throughout 1982 and in the decades since have never once caught a whiff of that behind-the-scenes strain. All they see is two people falling in love, which makes the professionalism behind that illusion almost as impressive as the performances themselves. The film's climactic hand-to-hand showdown between Mayo and Foley required weeks of careful choreography, since Gere had trained in a mix of taekwondo and kickboxing for the role, while Gossett came from a background in more traditional, classical karate. Two very different fighting styles, both actors pushing hard to make the sequence look convincingly real, and neither one wanting to be the guy who visibly pulled his punches. At some point during filming, according to Gere's own account given decades later in interviews, the pretend fight briefly stopped being pretend. Gere has said he struck Gossett hard enough during the sequence that his co-star was genuinely hurt, and Gossett reportedly walked off the set afterward rather than continue. Production had to pause for a stretch while things cooled down, with a stunt double reportedly brought in to cover some of the wider-angle shots until the two men were ready to finish the scene together. Given how close the two actors remained for decades afterward, right up until Gossett's death in 2024, it's clearly a moment that didn't leave any lasting resentment between them, even if it left a mark that day. Long before he became famous for putting on sunglasses in dramatic slow motion on CSI Miami, David Caruso was just another face in the crowd of officer candidates in this film. He plays Topper Daniels, a recruit who panics and washes out of the program during a water survival training exercise designed to simulate an aircraft ditching in the ocean. It's a small role, the kind of part where you could easily miss him entirely on a first viewing. But Caruso has pointed to this exact credit over the years as one of the small breaks that helped put him on Hollywood's radar. From there, his career built steadily toward a breakout role on NYPD Blue roughly a decade later, and eventually his own long-running leading role on television. Not a bad legacy for a character whose entire arc in the movie is failing to make it through the program. By the time filming wrapped on the Olympic Peninsula, this was not a movie anyone at the studio was betting on. It had no special effects, no built-in franchise appeal, no major marketing hook beyond its cast, just a modestly budgeted, working-class romance that reportedly cost somewhere between $6 and $7 million to make, a small figure even by early 1980 standards. Films like that typically get greenlit when a studio's release calendar has a gap that needs filling, then quietly get forgotten once they've served their purpose. Instead, word of mouth kept building steadily through the late summer of 1982, with audiences returning for repeat viewings and pulling friends along with them. By the time the final numbers were tallied, the film had brought in roughly $130 million domestically and closer to $190 million worldwide, an enormous return relative to its tiny production budget. That performance landed it among the very highest-grossing releases of the entire year, trailing only E.T. the Extraterrestrial and Tootsie. Genuinely surprising company for a film nobody at its own studio expected to be a hit. The scene everyone remembers, Zach marching into the paper factory in his crisp dress whites and sweeping Paula off her feet in front of her stunned co-workers, almost didn't happen at all. By most accounts, Gere genuinely disliked the idea, feeling that after nearly 2 hours of gritty, working-class realism, a storybook rescue felt tonally dishonest to everything that had come before it. He pushed back hard against shooting the scene as written, arguing it would come across as too sentimental for the film it was attached to. Director Taylor Hackford reportedly had his own doubts as well, right up until something unexpected happened during rehearsal. The extras playing the factory workers, with no instruction to react at all, began genuinely cheering and crying as the moment played out in front of them. What finally settled it for Gere, by his own telling, was watching the footage cut together with the newly finished closing song underneath it. The scene he had argued so hard against became, almost instantly, the ending that nobody who has seen this movie has ever managed to forget. There's also a quieter footnote buried in this story that most viewers have never had reason to notice. While the rest of the base and training sequences were shot around Fort Wardens, the factory floor itself was actually filmed at a working flour mill in nearby Bremerton, Washington, standing in for the paper mill described in the script. The song that plays underneath that famous ending very nearly didn't exist at all. Composer Jack Nish had scored most of the film but was reportedly struggling to land the right closing theme until his longtime songwriting collaborator, folk and roots musician Buffy St. Marie, shared a melody she had been developing for something entirely unrelated. Lyricist Will Jennings was brought in to build words around her tune after watching an early rough cut of the film, and singer Jennifer Warnes suggested turning the song into a duet, pairing her own voice with Joe Cocker's raspy delivery. Not everyone at Paramount was immediately convinced this was the right call. According to accounts from the production, one studio executive was so confident the song would flop that he made a personal wager against it ever becoming a hit. He lost that bet in dramatic fashion,